It had been a decade since my divorce, and in all those years, I hadn't experienced anything close to intimacy. Now, at 45, I had grown accustomed to sleeping alone, the quiet of my home a constant companion. But that Tuesday night, a night I'll never forget, changed everything. I lay in bed, exhaustion weighing heavily on me like a thick, suffocating blanket. The house was silent, as it always was, but this time the stillness didn't last. A soft, hesitant knock at the door broke the quiet. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up in the darkness. Something felt off. "Mom?" came Adrian's voice, barely a whisper. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. At 25, he was no longer the little boy I once tucked into bed. His pajamas hung loosely on his now broad shoulders, and his face carried the sharp features of a young man. His expression, vulnerable yet uncertain, stirred something deep within me, a mix of protectiveness and unease. "I can't sleep," he murmured. "Come here," I said softly, patting the empty space beside me on the bed. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and slipping under the covers. The bed shifted under his weight, and suddenly we were lying side by side, just inches apart. His warmth was immediate, radiating toward me. I tried not to look at him, but my eyes betrayed me. He wasn't a child anymore. His jawline was defined, his frame strong, and the realization left me both embarrassed and confused. His voice broke the silence again, fragile and quiet. "Sometimes it's just too much." I didn't know how to respond. Instead, I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, he turned toward me and pulled me into a tight embrace. His arms wrapped around me completely, his face pressing close to my neck. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and his breath warm against my skin. What surprised me most was how I instinctively hugged him back, a strange fluttering sensation rising in my chest. Adrian's face shifted slightly, his breath brushing my neck. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I murmured, "I'm here. I'm always here." But inside, I was anything but calm. My heart raced, and I couldn't make sense of the emotions swirling within me. There was an innocence to his actions, yes, but his embrace felt different. Closer, tighter, more intimate than I had expected. Eventually, his breathing slowed, and he drifted off to sleep. But I remained wide awake, my mind spinning with questions. What had just happened? There was something about the way he held me that felt too personal, too raw. And what unsettled me even more was that I couldn't simply dismiss it. When morning came, Adrian was still asleep beside me. The first rays of sunlight illuminated his face, and I couldn't help but study him. He looked peaceful, almost childlike, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I felt tangled, conflicted, and unsure of how to process the night before. Carefully, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. I needed space to think, to untangle the emotions that had taken root in my mind. Adrian always slept late, and I hoped the quiet of the morning would help me sort through my feelings. As I moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast, the events of the previous night replayed in my mind. One thing was certain. This wasn't just another ordinary night. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it. I began gathering ingredients to make pancakes, trying to focus on the simple task to distract myself. A few minutes later, I heard Adrian stirring. Glancing toward the doorway, I saw him peeking out, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a strange tone, a mix of exhaustion and something else I couldn't quite place. "Morning, honey," I replied, forcing a smile as I flipped the pancakes. I was doing my best to act normal, but I could feel his eyes on me. There was something different about the way he looked at me this morning. His usual indifference was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity that made me uneasy. His gaze wasn't casual. It felt deliberate, as though he was studying me, tracing the lines of my body. I tried to ignore it, but the weight of his stare was impossible to shake. My heart began to race, though I worked hard to keep my composure, pretending everything was fine. Adrian's behavior had shifted. Normally, he was relaxed and cheerful around me, but today there was a distance between us, a line he seemed hesitant to cross. Yet his eyes told a different story. They lingered on me, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I placed the pancakes on a plate and handed it to him. "Enjoy," I said, my voice tinged with a hint of gloom. As Adrian took the plate, his hands brushed mine briefly, and our eyes met for a fleeting moment. It felt like he was searching for something deeper within me, something I wasn't ready to confront. I noticed a nervous reflection in my own eyes, but Adrian stayed silent. He sat down at the table, his gaze avoiding mine, yet every time I moved, his eyes would dart back to me with that same unsettling intensity. Throughout breakfast, he didn't speak much, but his awareness of me was palpable. It was as if he was hyper-focused on my every movement, something we'd never experienced before. The turmoil inside me grew, a quiet voice whispering that I needed to figure this out soon. But I still couldn't fully grasp what was happening. Adrian's glances and behavior had created a deep emotional confusion within me. And now, in the kitchen, surrounded by the warm aroma of pancakes, that strange tension lingered. Something was stirring inside me, but I resisted it. I was acutely aware of Adrian's eyes on me, yet all I wanted was to fulfill my role as a mother. This morning was supposed to be about breakfast, but the warmth and unease coursing through me felt like something entirely different. As night fell, sleep began to tug at my eyelids, but something fell off. I could sense it, though I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The loneliness in my room grew heavier, but this time it was different. Adrian's behavior toward me seemed to be evolving into something I couldn't quite understand. Slowly, I drifted into a restless sleep, my eyes fluttering open and closed throughout the night. I could feel something approaching, but I didn't know what. Suddenly, I heard a noise. My eyes shot open in the dark room, and I could make out a shadow moving slowly. My heart raced, and for a moment, everything blurred. Then, I realized the shadow was Adrian. He had stepped into the room through the slightly open door. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him, my son, standing in the middle of the night in my room. I should have been asleep, but Adrian's presence filled the room. His eyes glimmered in the darkness, their intensity mirroring the night before. My mind raced, struggling to focus. What was I supposed to do? The confusion inside me grew louder, more insistent. Adrian being in my room at this hour was strange enough, but it felt like an echo of something. Only this time, it was different. His eyes, his demeanor, the way he moved closer. It all carried a weight I couldn't ignore. He took another step forward, closing the distance between us. The faint moonlight filtering through the window illuminated his face, just enough for me to see it more clearly. His expression was more determined than I'd ever seen it, and deep inside, a voice screamed at me, "Don't let this happen." But before I could react, Adrian leaned in and pressed his lips against mine. Time seemed to freeze. The world spun around me, yet I stood motionless, caught in a moment that defied everything I knew. My son, just a step away, had kissed me. Emotions tangled together in a chaotic knot. This wasn't something a mother ever expects from her child. My heart pounded wildly, and I quickly pulled away, pushing him back. "Stop. No," I said breathlessly, my words barely audible, vanishing into the air like a whisper. Adrian stepped back, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes, but he remained standing there, tall and unwavering. "Adrian, this isn't right. Don't do this," I pleaded, my voice trembling. My head spun, my body drenched in sweat. I couldn't control the storm of emotions raging inside me. My son, approaching me this way, it was terrifying, complicated. Yet, a part of me couldn't deny the attention, the focus he was giving me. But this wasn't right. I had to remain a mother, always, right? The intensity in Adrian's eyes, a look I'd never seen before, shook me to my core. My heart raced so fiercely it felt like it might burst. I knew I had to pull myself together. Adrian took a step back, silent, but the quiet between us grew heavier, more suffocating. Then he moved closer again, his lips meeting mine once more. His hands trailed down from my neck to my waist, then to my hips. No matter how much I told myself to stop, I couldn't resist. That night, whatever happened, happened. When morning came, I woke up alone, Adrian no longer beside me. I took a deep breath. try and collect myself, but the weight of what had transpired pressed down on me. I left the house without a word, my eyes heavy with weariness, my chest hollow. Each step felt like a struggle, as though I were lost, battling within myself. The only thing I knew for certain was that I needed to understand what had happened. I questioned my feelings, but with every passing second, everything seemed to grow more tangled, more complicated. That night, whatever it was, felt like a dream, hazy and surreal. My heart still raced as I left the house, silent and conflicted. I tried to bury what had happened between Adrian and me, to suppress the emotions, to erase it all. But something inside me was breaking. Why did I feel so torn? Why was I so mixed up? I felt lost, adrift in a sea of chaos. My son, was no longer just a child. But was I still seeing him as one? Was I fooling myself? What was I supposed to do?